The ballroom sparkled with opulence. Under golden chandeliers, executives mingled, glasses clinked, and laughter rippled through polished air. At the center stood Richard Hanover, mid-50s, Caucasian, sharp in a midnight blue tuxedo, CEO of Hanover Dynamics, commanding attention like a general before battle. Then came a pause. A young black man, tall poised, wearing a waiter's uniform, approached with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. The CEO's smile faded. Without hesitation he sneered and said, "Don't touch my table. Get someone else." The room froze, tension thick as velvet. Guests glanced around, embarrassed. The waiter nodded silently, expression unreadable. As he turned away, a guest whispered, "That's going to cost him." Hanover didn't hear or care. But someone else did. A man in the shadows, observing, recording, waiting. Image prompts, we. Outside the ballroom, the night air was crisp. The waiter stood alone near the catering van, now just a man in silence under a silver moon. His name was Elijah Morrow, and tonight wasn't his first taste of humiliation, but this one hit different. Not because of the words, but the weight behind them. He pulled off the bow tie slowly, watching it fall into his palm. "Same story, different suit," he muttered. But Elijah wasn't just any waiter. The uniform was temporary. He had a plan, something he'd rehearsed for months. What Richard didn't know was that Elijah had already been scheduled to meet with him under very different terms. And that meeting would have changed Hanover's future. Tonight, Elijah just confirmed something instead. The man didn't deserve it. Inside the ballroom, laughter resumed as if nothing had happened. But not everyone had moved on. A tech investor named James Reed, mid-40s, mixed race, stylish in a charcoal suit, tapped on his phone under the table. He had seen everything, and recognized Elijah instantly. "He actually did it," Reed whispered, amused and impressed. He sent a single text. He passed. James had been part of Elijah's quiet plan, to test who Richard really was. The $5 million deal wasn't just business, it was a test of character. And Richard had failed it before the meeting even began. Back in the city, hours later, Elijah sat at a minimalist glass desk in his penthouse apartment. The city skyline flickered behind him. He wasn't celebrating, he was reflecting. He opened a document labeled "Hanover Proposal Terminated" and hit send. That file contained the withdrawal of a $5 million funding round Hanover desperately needed. Elijah leaned back in his chair, eyes heavy with purpose, not revenge. "Lesson delivered," he said quietly. This wasn't about ego. It was about principle. And tomorrow, the world would know the kind of man Richard really was. Meanwhile, Richard sat in his limo, scrolling through his inbox. A new email arrived from Morrow Ventures. He clicked and froze. Eyes darted, mouth slightly open. He reread the words. "Due to recent events, we are withdrawing from all negotiations. Your character assessment did not meet our standard." Richard's fingers trembled. He knew exactly what this was. The waiter. The deal. Gone. Why? He leaned back, face pale under the passing streetlight. For the first time in a long time, Richard Hanover felt something unfamiliar. Powerless. Elijah Morrow didn't come from wealth. Born and raised in the heart of Detroit, he'd watched his single mother juggle 3 jobs while pushing him to chase something bigger. He never forgot the night he slept in their broken-down car, cradling a textbook while his mom cried quietly in the front seat. Now, years later, he stood in his own tech firm, Morrow Innovations, a glass tower built from grit, not privilege. He didn't just build code, he built opportunity. His team was diverse, brilliant, and loyal. They didn't work for him, they worked with him. And every decision he made was rooted in the promise he made to his mother. "One day, I'll make sure no one like us has to beg for respect." That's why the rejection at the ballroom mattered. Not because of pride, but because it confirmed what he was still up against. After the boardroom cleared, Elijah remained behind, staring out at the city below. His CTO, Priya Shah, 30s, Indian American, brilliant and fiercely loyal, entered quietly. "You sure you're okay?" she asked. Elijah nodded, but his jaw tightened. "I needed to see it. Not just hear rumors. I needed to look that kind of arrogance in the eye." Priya stepped closer, her voice lower. "You had every right to throw that drink in his face." Elijah chuckled. "Yeah, but I'd rather throw his future out the window." Quietly, Priya smiled. "Then I'd say mission accomplished." Elijah turned from the window and said, "Not yet. This isn't just about Hanover. It's about all of them. Every gatekeeper that decides who belongs and who doesn't based on a handshake and a glance. That ends with us." That night, Elijah returned to his mother's small suburban home. The smell of jasmine tea drifted from the kitchen. His mother, Evelyn Morrow, late 60s, graceful with deep-set eyes and gray streaks in her braided hair, greeted him with a warm hug. "You look tired," she said softly. "I'm not tired," Elijah replied. "I'm just awake." They sat in silence for a while, sipping tea under the porch light. "You know," Evelyn said, "your father would have been proud, not because of your money, but because of your restraint." Elijah smiled faintly. "Sometimes I wonder if he would have done more." Evelyn took his hand. "He would have reminded you that power isn't in what you say. It's in what you don't need to say. You didn't just walk away tonight. You made sure he knew why." That was all Elijah needed to hear. Meanwhile, across the city, James Reed met with his private network of equity partners. The room was sleek, filled with rising tech powerhouses. Diverse, driven, disruptive. James projected the video he captured of Richard Hanover's rejection on a large screen. Murmurs filled the room. One investor leaned forward. "So that's the guy?" James nodded. "He was warned. We don't fund fossils. We fund founders who understand the future looks different now." Another voice chimed in, "Pulling $5 million will hurt him bad." James smirked. "That's the point. Let it sting. Maybe then people like him will stop judging the worth of a man by the color of his uniform." The room agreed in silence. A new standard had been set. Back at Hanover Dynamics, Richard Hanover was pacing his corner office. The once confident titan now looked shaken. Emails went unanswered. Calls were ignored. His PR team tried spinning the narrative, but it wasn't working. The video had leaked, and it was everywhere. Hashtags calling for boycotts, internal HR murmurs, and shareholder threats piled up. Richard stared out at the city, watching the lights flicker in the dark. For the first time he saw himself the way others had always seen him, small, privileged, and out of touch. His reflection in the glass was distorted. Behind him, an assistant knocked. "Sir, Forbes just called. They want a statement." Richard didn't turn. He just muttered, "Tell them I'm not available." And for the first time no one came to fix it. The storm was spreading fast. Within 24 hours, the video of Richard Hanover's dismissal of Elijah had gone viral. News anchors dissected it. Commentators debated it. Young professionals reposted it with hashtags like #uniform, does not define worth, and #quiet power. Even late-night hosts took swings. But more than anger, it stirred something else, reflection. In offices, on campuses, in cafes, people were asking, "How many times have I done that without noticing?" Elijah didn't post a single word. He didn't need to. His silence became the loudest message. Meanwhile, Hanover's inbox flooded with apologies, denials, and cancellations. Answers dropped. A key client sent a one-line message, "This isn't who we want to do business with." Richard, once the man who called all the shots, now couldn't control a single narrative. In a tucked-away co-working hub, a young black founder named Marcus tapped his laptop screen. "This guy," he said, showing Elijah's image, "he's why I didn't quit last year." His team of startup interns gathered around. They weren't watching for the scandal. They were watching for the example. He had every reason to blow up. But he didn't. He moved with grace. And he still won. Across the room, one woman added, "He showed us that silence isn't surrender, it's strategy." In that moment, Elijah's name became more than a headline. It became a symbol, not of revenge, but of controlled, earned power. For a generation told to sit down, he proved that sometimes, just standing still and watching them fall is enough. Hanover sat alone in his home office, the space once a trophy case of corporate dominance. The shelves now felt heavy with failure. He rewatched the video on mute, again and again. Each time, his face looked more unfamiliar, more pathetic. His wife hadn't spoken to him since the headline dropped. His board had called an emergency session. And for the first time in years, he questioned himself. He wasn't just losing a contract, he was losing credibility, respect, and the illusion of control. He whispered to no one. Was it really just one moment? But, deep down, he knew it wasn't. It was every moment like that one, repeated over decades, never questioned. Until now. The reckoning wasn't sudden. It was earned. Elijah sat with James Reed again, this time at a quiet rooftop bar under fading orange skies. "You didn't have to post the video," Elijah said, sipping his drink. James replied, "I didn't do it for views. I did it because too many of us get tested in silence. You passed. He failed. The world deserved to see the difference." Elijah nodded slowly. "Sometimes I wonder if I went too far." James shook his head. "You didn't go far enough. That man's been failing people like us behind closed doors for decades. You just turned on the lights." Elijah stared at the skyline and said, "Then I guess it's time to make the next room brighter." It wasn't about destroying Hanover. It was about building something better in his place. Across the city, in a classroom at a community college, a young woman named Nia played the video for her peers. "This isn't just about race," she explained. "It's about power, bias, and how we treat people when we think they're beneath us." Students nodded. Some shifted uncomfortably. One raised a hand and asked, "But what if he'd fought back? Wouldn't that prove the stereotype?" Nia smiled. "That's the trap. They expect fire. So when you respond with water, measured, intelligent, focused, they drown in their own heat." Her professor watched quietly, impressed. In rooms like this, the real revolution was taking root, not with noise but with clarity. Elijah's story had sparked something more powerful than outrage. It sparked vision. Hanover's boardroom no longer echoed with applause. It trembled with tension. The emergency meeting had begun. Around the long table sat a dozen executives, once loyal, now wary. Screens displayed headlines: "CEO under fire for discrimination. Investor pullout rocks Hanover dynamics." Richard stood at the head, eyes hollow. "We can spin this," he began, but the board chair, a sharp-eyed woman named Karen Lee, cut in. "We don't need spin. We need accountability." Murmurs of agreement followed. Richard's voice cracked slightly. "It was a misunderstanding." Another board member replied, "It wasn't. And now you've cost us millions." The room felt colder with every second. Richard wasn't just losing power, he was losing the room. And that terrified him more than the headlines ever could. Later that evening, Elijah walked into a private media studio, this time by choice. The producer greeted him with a smile. "We're live in 30. Elijah nodded. He declined interviews for days, letting the story speak for itself. But now he was ready to speak, not to defend himself, but to define the moment. The lights warmed the studio, and as the countdown hit 0, Elijah looked into the camera, not as the man in the waiter uniform, but as a CEO. "This wasn't about revenge," he began. "It was about awareness. We don't ask for perfection. We ask for respect." Across the country, viewers leaned in. He wasn't angry. He was clear. And in that clarity, Elijah's voice reshaped the conversation. On leadership, equity, and what real power sounds like. In an upscale restaurant, just blocks from where it all started, a new kind of dinner was underway. Elijah, James, Priya, and several rising entrepreneurs gathered for what they called the table that welcomes. No dress codes. No gatekeeping. just minds meeting across food and stories. A young Latina founder, Ana, raised a toast to the moment they underestimated us and handed us the mic instead. Laughter echoed. No bitterness, just boldness. Elijah looked around and smiled. The same kind of room where he was once dismissed now held every kind of brilliance he had long fought to lift. "This," he said, lifting his glass, "is the future of business, and it looks a lot more like us." Meanwhile, Richard Hanover stood outside the same ballroom where it all began. The marquee lights flickered above, spelling out someone else's gala. He wasn't invited this time. He watched attendees enter in sharp suits and flowing gowns, unnoticed by them all. A man who once dominated these spaces now hovered like a ghost. His reflection stared back at him in the mirrored glass doors, wrinkled, tired, forgotten. He tried to smile, but it didn't land. A valet offered, "Can I help you, sir?" Hanover paused, then shook his head. "No, just passing by." And for the first time in his life, that's all he was. Someone passing by a world that had moved on without him. Back in Elijah's office, a young intern knocked timidly. "Sir, there's someone here to see you. Said you met at the gala." Elijah looked up, puzzled. In stepped the ballroom's headwaiter, older Caribbean accent, eyes kind but firm. "I just wanted to thank you," he said. "Not for what you did to him, for what you showed all of us. You gave silence a voice." Elijah stood, extended a hand. "No one should ever feel invisible. Not in any room." The man nodded, emotion rising in his eyes. As he left, Elijah sat back down, looking out over the city. The storm had passed. But the mission wasn't over. He wasn't just rewriting one man's fate. He was redefining what leadership looked like for generations to come. Elijah stepped into the Hanover Dynamics building, not as a waiter, but as a power broker. Security paused him at the door, confused. "I'm expected," he said calmly. Minutes later, he entered the executive suite. Richard sat behind his desk, exhausted, worn, diminished. "You came here to rub it in?" Richard asked. Elijah shook his head. "No. I came to explain why it had to be you." Richard narrowed his eyes. "Why me?" Elijah stepped closer. "Because you are the system, the polished, polite face of every closed door we've had to push open. You needed to see what it feels like when the door shuts on you, for no reason other than what someone assumed." Richard sat speechless. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone was louder than any lecture. "And Richard?" He finally listened. "You know what hurts the most?" Richard muttered. "I didn't even think about it. You were just background." Elijah nodded slowly. "Exactly. And yet I was the person holding your future in my hand." The silence stretched between them. No cameras. No social media. Just a reckoning. "Do you want to fix it?" Elijah asked. Richard blinked. "Can I?" Elijah replied. "Not for me. But maybe for who you are after this." Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. That was Elijah's choice. Not revenge, not gloating, but closure. In that moment, Richard understood something he never had before. Power isn't loud. It's quiet. It's in who chooses to walk away when they could have destroyed you, and still doesn't. Outside, Elijah paused in front of the building. Reporters waited across the street, cameras ready, questions flying. He raised a hand, not to speak, but to signal calm. "No comment today," he said. "Let the actions speak for themselves." Then he climbed into the back of a modest black sedan and disappeared into the flow of city traffic. The media didn't get their soundbite, but they got their image. The man who said nothing, but said everything. And that image traveled fast. Not of anger, not of scandal, but of restraint, dignity, and strength that doesn't need to be loud to leave a mark. As the car drove off, someone whispered, "That's the guy who changed everything." And indeed, he had. Back at Morrow Innovations, Elijah's staff gathered in the atrium for a quiet celebration. No confetti, No speeches. Just respect. Priya clinked her glass. To the man who reminded us that power isn't granted, it's claimed. Elijah lifted his water bottle instead of champagne. To all of you, you made this moment possible. And now, let's build something bigger than a moment. Applause followed, not loud, but heartfelt. In a corner, a new intern whispered, "I want to be like him." That was the legacy Elijah wanted. Not headlines or hashtags, but hope. A future where people could rise without pretending, and where rooms like these were built to welcome, not exclude. Late that night, Elijah returned to his rooftop. Alone, he stood at the edge, the city lights stretching endlessly below. He took a deep breath, the weight of the week lifting. Behind him, his phone buzzed. Unread messages, media requests, business proposals. He ignored them all. Tonight wasn't about opportunity. It was about peace. He looked up at the sky, whispered, "Thank you, Mom," and closed his eyes. In that quiet, the story finally settled. Not just his, but the story of every person who'd been overlooked, rejected, or dismissed. Tonight, they stood taller because he had. And tomorrow, the work would begin again. But for now, silence was enough. And it was beautiful. Richard Hanover's empire was crumbling. One by one, contracts were pulled, partnerships frozen, and internal reports leaked. Hanover Dynamics stock plunged 32% in a week. Inside the once bustling executive floor, desks were being cleared. The atmosphere was no longer tense, it was hollow. Employees whispered, "Is this it?" Richard sat in a glass-walled conference room alone, watching a news ticker scroll. Hanover faces investor exodus after viral discrimination clip. A secretary walked in quietly and handed him a folder. "Final board vote is in," she said. He opened it slowly. The motion was clear, unanimous, termination of CEO authority. Richard exhaled, slow and shallow. There was no applause, no shouting, just the sound of reality settling in like dust. Outside the building, reporters crowded around a sleek podium. Karen Lee, Hanover Dynamics board chair, stepped up with prepared remarks. Effective immediately, Richard Hanover has been removed as CEO. This decision reflects not just public response, but the core values we expect from leadership. She paused, let the words hang. "We must do better." Flashes popped, hands raised, but she took no questions. Her message had already echoed worldwide. In corporate offices everywhere, quiet conversations were happening about who gets hired, who gets heard, who gets ignored. And behind those conversations, one image lingered, the moment a man in a waiter's uniform held the mirror up to power. And power flinched. Across town, in a humble neighborhood school, Elijah arrived unannounced to visit a mentorship program he had quietly funded for years. The kids didn't see a tech mogul, they saw someone who looked like them and had made it. One boy asked, "Did you really fire a CEO?" Elijah smiled. "No. He fired himself the moment he thought he was better than someone else." Laughter followed. Then silence. "But I didn't come to talk about him," Elijah continued. "I came to talk about you, because you are the story now." That moment wasn't about contracts or viral videos. It was about planting seeds. Seeds that would grow in rooms that didn't exist yet, rooms these kids would one day own. Richard sat on a park bench, dressed down in jeans and a coat, unshaven and unreadable. The world moved past him, joggers, dog walkers, kids playing. No one recognized him anymore. A small girl dropped her ice cream cone nearby and began to cry. Instinctively, Richard reached into his pocket, walked over, and handed her a few crumpled bills. Her mother nodded politely. "Thank you." It wasn't much, but it was the first human connection Richard had made in days. No control. No audience. Just a simple act with no expectation. As he sat back down, he looked at his hands. For the first time in years, they looked real, not powerful. Just human. And maybe that was a start. At Morrow Innovations, a new plaque was mounted in the main hall. Respect requires no uniform. Below it, a photo of Elijah in the waiter's attire. The exact moment that started it all. It wasn't glorification. It was a reminder. Every visitor, partner, or employee would pass it. Elijah watched from a distance as a young employee stopped to stare at it. She pulled out her phone and took a picture. Priya stepped beside him and asked, "Still think you went too far?" Elijah shook his head. "Not far enough, but we're getting there." The building buzzed around them with motion and purpose. It wasn't a finish line. It was the beginning of something bigger. And this time, everyone had a seat at the table. A month later, Elijah stood backstage at a leadership summit, moments from delivering the keynote. He glanced over his note cards, then tucked them away. No script needed. Not for this. As he stepped into the spotlight, the applause began, not wild, but steady. Respectful. Earned. "I wasn't always seen," Elijah began. "Not in the rooms that mattered, not in the ways that counted, but I learned something. When they don't see you, it's not your eyes that are closed. It's theirs." The room quieted. This isn't about revenge. This is about reminder. That leadership isn't a title. It's how you treat people when you think no one's watching. The applause returned, this time stronger. And this time, Elijah didn't just feel heard. He felt seen. Richard Hanover watched the speech from a small TV in the corner of a public library. No reporters. No board. Just him, earbuds in, alone at a side desk. His hair was longer now, his suit replaced with a sweater and jeans. But his eyes were clearer. When Elijah spoke about leadership, Richard didn't flinch. He nodded. Not with guilt, but with recognition. The kind that only comes after you've been broken and humbled. A librarian walked by, glancing at the screen. "He's good," she said. Richard replied softly, "He's better than good." And for the first time in a long while, Richard felt something unfamiliar, but welcome. Peace in knowing he'd finally heard what he never used to listen for. Later that evening, Elijah visited a quiet cemetery. He stood at his father's grave, hands in pockets, city lights flickering in the distance. "I kept my promise," he whispered. "I showed them who we are." He knelt and placed a single white rose on the stone. "And I did it without raising my voice." He stood, taking a long breath. "You were right, Dad. Dignity doesn't shout. It just stands tall." As he turned to leave, a light breeze stirred his coat, and the distant sound of children laughing echoed from the nearby park. Life was moving on. But this time it was moving forward, not just around him. He didn't need headlines to prove he'd won. His peace said it all. At a small cafe near the edge of town, a barista handed a coffee to an older man who sat quietly in the corner. "You come here often?" she asked. Richard nodded. "The coffee's strong, and no one knows my name. That's rare." She smiled. "Well, you're welcome to stay as long as you like." Richard took a sip and stared out the window. No business calls. No deals. Just steam rising and people passing. And for once he didn't crave power. He craved peace. He took out a small notepad and began to write. Not emails. Not speeches. Just thoughts. Maybe, in losing everything, he'd finally found space to begin again. And this time he'd listen more than he spoke. The final image. Elijah walking alone across a quiet bridge at sunrise. No entourage. No cameras. Just the sound of footsteps and the hum of morning. His silhouette framed by rising light, his posture calm and unhurried. As he reaches the center, he pauses, hands resting on the railing. Below, the city wakes, trains running, doors opening, lives beginning. A final voiceover plays, echoing Elijah's keynote. Respect isn't about titles, it's about choices, and sometimes the loudest revolution comes dressed in silence. The screen fades to black. One last line lingers in white text. How you treat the least visible, says everything about who you are. And then, silence. Not empty, but full.